to you. So now we've got Laura Roberts, two people from Australia coming on next. So Laura, can I hand the floor to you next?
Good morning. Thanks, Susan, for that wonderful welcoming and acknowledgement. I'm coming from the land of the Kaurna people, so I acknowledge that these are the lands on which I live and work, and that sovereignty has not been ceded, and there is no treaty like there is in New Zealand. I am a lecturer in women's and gender studies, and my background is the philosophy of Luce Irigaray, so feminist philosophy. I've thought a lot about the mother-daughter relation in Irigaray's work and the maternal, but always from, I guess now I realize, the perspective of the daughter. And I became a mother almost 2 years ago, and that's flipped things considerably. So my paper today is going to be about Cavalero and Irigaray. And because of the time difference, I unfortunately haven't seen any of the conference papers yet, so I'm coming in a bit blind. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to listening to the recordings when I can get my hands on them. So thank you, Anna, for organising this. I'm really looking forward to it. The longer version of this paper is part of an edited collection on Luce Irigaray, a celebration of her book Speculum of the Other Woman. And in that paper, I explain how that book is attempting to unravel a specular infrastructure. It's attempting to show how the figure of the maternal feminine supports the processes of the male imaginary. This is a quote from Margaret Whitford, but it's not herself represented. And this is a neglect equivalent to matricide at the beginning of the Western philosophical tradition. So I argue that alongside others, Irigaray's philosophy in the feminine, which becomes a project of psychoanalyzing the philosophers, the male philosophers, is guided by two goals. One is to look for the specular relations using sort of a psychoanalytic method, and the other is to uncover the buried mother. In doing so, Irigaray's project seeks, and I quote Alison Stone here, to remember our maternal and uterine origins and explore how our unresolved preoccupations with them reverberate in philosophical texts. Alison Stone writes, she wants to remind us that we have been born. And so this is sort of where my paper is going. According to Irigaray, from Plato onwards, man, the subject's relation to a maternal feminine body, and thus to birth and to gestation, remains the blind spot. It remains an unrepresentable elsewhere to all Western philosophy and theory, and thus sort of politics as well, and culture. For Irigaray, the consequences of this means that subjectivity in these Western traditions is only ever conceived of as a singular, atomistic, self-sufficient and masculine. The paradigm of the white Western man, cut off from the body, and the possibility of at least two autonomously defined yet relational sexuate subjects. And I use sexuate here to sort of suggest something different from a biological difference. So sexuate difference for Irigaray is foreclosed. Her project then, which begins in Speculum 50 years ago now, but continues through to the present, is to uncover this appropriation of the maternal within Western philosophy and the erasure, while at the same time creating the imaginary and symbolic mediations necessary for a second feminine subject to emerge. Part of this project, that's really sort of a 5-second summary. Part of this project, what I'm going to focus on today, this creating the conditions for a second feminine subject to emerge, part of this project is her notion of sexuate rights. I'm going to focus on this notion and turn to Adriana Cavarero's philosophy of birth and her reworked mythic figure of Demeter as an imaginary example of what an autonomous sexuate subjectivity with appropriate sexuate rights in an Irigayan sense might look like. So Irigaray's work on sexuate rights, and I've written on this Irigayan sexuate rights and Indigenous Australians critiques of colonialism, the work of Irene Watson. I've got a paper on this, but anyway, it's controversial. It's often misunderstood. And we must understand the call for these rights in the context of her argument in Speculum, which is why I've attempted to give you a very brief summary there. And the call to reimagine subjectivity in ourselves as living, embodied, embedded, sexuate beings, always in non-hierarchical relation, right? Sexual difference and difference is key to this work. So in calling for sexuate rights, Irigaray, it's part of a strategy to reimagine this identity as sexuate, as at least as a challenge to the phallocentrism of the singular abstracted masculine subject that underlies and undergirds Western culture and philosophy. Sexuate rights are key to rethinking subjectivity as sexuate. She explains in her book, Democracy Begins Between Two, and I quote here because it's quite a nice quote, it's a bit long. We must now change the context in which we live, and more radically, the framework of our identity. This entails a revolution as wide, if not far more wide-ranging than the Copernican one. We have to rethink the model of subjectivity, which has served us for centuries, not in order to add a little bit here or a little bit there, but so that we can abandon the model of a single subject altogether. This does not mean that the one of the subject can become many, plus or minus the one, but the subject is at least two, she writes, man and woman, are two in relation that are not bi-univocal. End quote. So if we challenge the abstraction of the singular subject or the singular self in Western traditions and the double exclusion of the woman mother from the origins of the tradition, the returning to the embodied and embedded living being means recognizing the sexuate sexuate nature of subjectivity. This is what Irigaray's Sexuate Rights is, in attempting to inscribe this in law. It's a strategy. Irigaray writes, and this is an example, she's got sort of examples of sexuate rights throughout her work. This is one. What has to be defined as rights for women is what the people of men amongst themselves, so that sort of patriarchal understanding, has appropriated as its property, including that which concerns women's bodies, children's bodies, as well as natural space, dwelling places, the economy of signs and images, social and religious representationality. End quote. She writes that we have to ask those who are preventing us from doing so for the rights associated with the recognition of a civil identity appropriate to our natural identity. And she gives the example of the right to the free choice of maternity. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. The right to a culture appropriate to us, etc. She goes on with lots of different rights. She ends up, in I Love to You, putting forward these rights to the European Union that it ends up not going through. But anyway, I'm going to focus on this notion of the right to the free choice of maternity. And in order to offer a deeper understanding of these sexuate rights, I turn to Adriana Cavarero's philosophy of birth, which I think is quite magnificent. And it offers an Irigaray example of an autonomous sexuate subjectivity that also offers an image of a sexuate right concerned with this right to the free choice of maternity. So, a philosophy of birth and sexuate rights. Adriana Cavarero takes up Irigaray's call to contribute to reinventing the feminine imaginary, aiming to disrupt this phallocentric socio-symbolic structure in her book In Spite of Plato, published in Italian in 1990 and translated to English in 1995. In this work, Cavarero is inspired by Irigaray's philosophical project, as well as Hannah Arendt's notion of natality. She calls for Western philosophy to recognize the philosophical significance of birth. And part of this is to move away from a symbolic focus on death, which is what Cavarero is arguing that Western philosophy does. So she seeks to contribute to this revolution of the Western socio-symbolic order through writing new mythic figures into a new feminist feminine imaginary and attempting to bring forth a symbolic order based on birth and not death. She explains that she steals ancient mythic figures from their contexts, rewrites them. She's unconcerned with the objective meanings of these new figures because they are reactivated by a new way of thinking, a philosophy of sexual difference. So the influence of Irigaray is clear. This audacious disregard for the objective meanings of these mythic figures most certainly follows the tone of a rigorized speculum. Her intention here is absolutely part of this philosophy of the feminine, presenting us with new mythic figures constituted by a rebellion against phallocentric logics, aiming to subvert the phallocentric order by writing sexual difference and sexual difference. Her writing also offers, I argue, a clear example of this sexuate right in relation to a free choice of maternity. So I turn to Cavarero's rereading of the ancient Greek figure of Demeter, goddess of harvest and agriculture, presiding over crops, grains, and fertility of the earth. Returning to this figure now, 25 years after Cavarero writes this, feels all the more relevant today, where calls for restrictions on women's reproductive rights are not only happening in the US and Europe, but have recently been proposed and only defeated by one vote where I live in the state in South Australia, which have only sort of recently decriminalized abortion a few years ago, and emerged as a key election talking point in the recent state elections in Queensland on the east coast of Australia. Cavarero's feminist rewriting of this myth offers an example of what imagining new autonomous feminist figures into the Western symbolic might look like, as well as offering the opportunity to think through the philosophical and political implications of recognizing maternal power and maternity as, to quote Cavarero, the matrix of the arrival of humans into the world. And in doing so, we begin to imagine what a symbolic order based on birth and not death might mean for philosophy, subjectivity, and the polis and politics. It offers a dream of what sexual rights might look like as the founding of a new democracy. But first, let's turn to Demeter. In the ancient Greek myth, Demeter is the great mother. Demeter's daughter, Cora, or Persephone, I can never say that, is kidnapped by Hades, king of the underworld. In response to the separation from her daughter, Demeter, the great mother, renders the whole earth sterile. This persuades Hades to return Cora to her mother for a period each year. Cavarero's reading highlights how the mother-daughter relationship is torn apart and the order of birth, she argues, is interrupted. Exiled into a masculine order, Cora is no longer Demeter's daughter, but Hades' wife, and her future sons and daughters will be Hades' children. The violence of this myth is not unusual or remote, Cavarero reminds us, and I quote here, "The codes of modern society still carry it and inscribe it, and we can see this in the way that many women still take the family name of their husband." So this notion of erasing maternal genealogies or feminine genealogies. Most importantly, however, in Cavarero's hand, the agricultural interpretation of the myth falls to the background as she highlights the power of the mother, which is inscribed in all nature as the power to both generate and not to generate. She writes, "This is an absolute power that presides over the place from which humans come into the world and over nothingness, as birth no more, the end point of the maternal continuum, which also marks symbolically the end of the world," end quote. This is not the nothingness of male philosophers, but the nothingness of birth. In this feminist rewriting of the figure of Demeter, we are presented with a sovereign figure of female subjectivity, Cavarero writes, who decides in the concrete singularity of every woman whether or not to generate. This act of generating, Cavarero writes, is a prerogative rooted in her power and therefore in her choice to carry it out. The recognition of this power grounds an order of birth. And as I've just noted, this power also carries the possibility of nothingness, the annihilation of humankind, which is what happens in the absence of an order of the female gaze. When mother and daughter are separated, their gender can no longer take root and spread in the reciprocal gaze. The mother stops generating when the daughter is snatched out of sight. Thus, without relations between and among sovereign women who articulate and live in their potential power to generate or not generate, we are faced with the annihilation of humankind. What a powerful image of feminine subjectivity we are presented with here. Untouched by phallocentric logics, emerging in relation with another woman's subject, and almost impossible to imagine in our current state of affairs, which is also kind of the point. The shift in the symbolic from death to birth thus implies a global rethinking of the meaning of the world that would reach well beyond a simple claim of female autonomy in the matter of abortion, writes Cavarero. This is not a claim for equal rights under phallocentric liberal logics. It's much bigger than that. It is, I suggest, an example of what a sexuate right of the free choice of maternity might look like. This claim exceeds a claim for equality and presents a challenge to our current thinking of not only democracy, but the world, really. An order of birth thus involves a rethinking of the meaning of the world that goes far beyond a simple claim of female autonomy. We thus require a philosophy of birth, I argue, that gives voice to the sovereign maternal power, a voice, to quote Cavarero again, that acknowledges the dignity of being alive as either woman or man, or in all our genders, thanks to our common maternal origin. And this happens before our social integration, she writes, into the father's political order. So a symbolic based on birth is not only focused on recognizing a sovereign female subjectivity and our relations to the maternal body and birth, it releases all humankind from the oppressive order of death and the abstraction from nature. A symbolic order founded on birth offers the possibility of restoring, Cavarero writes, meaning to maternal power and to the reality of those who are born. This is because at birth we have the one who is generated, all of us. Here's a longer quote by Cavarero. The one who is born comes to measure the concreteness of being in the world, in this way and not otherwise, in a process of birth through which he or she first appears in the world as whole. Certainly the one who is born also belongs to the polis and will have to live with others, both male and female, and we can add in all our genders, according to common rules, probably negotiated, contingent, and revisable. But these rules would not aim at defining what belongs to the secret of the natal relationship, a secret that takes the form of a mother's decision bequeathed by the nature of to the origin of every living human being before social integration. I'm nearly finished here. How am I doing for time? I've got a few minutes. In Cavarero's philosophy of birth, we recognize that subjectivity then is intimately connected with both nature and culture, and the shift to an order of birth will narrow the societal sphere and allows the meaning of human life to exist outside the confines of the polis. Cavarero writes, it is thus understood that before being a citizen, everyone is a human born of a mother, and every mother is as such above and beyond being a citizen. For in the polis, she does not negotiate the maternal power that concretely belongs to her sex, nor does she allow others to negotiate it, end quote. It is non-negotiable. Maternity is not a common good. It is not in the service of the polis, patriarchy, and capitalism, and does not need to abide by these rules. We must imagine other ways of being in the world where philosophical significance is given to birth and to our relations with the maternal body. Cavarero gestures towards imagining a new polis with new politics, a politics negotiated not by abstract individuals, but instead by concrete men and women rooted in a different kind of sexedness. This is a quote, since they come into the world gendered in one way or another. They are also differentiated in 1,000 other ways that bind them to the specific options and interests that inevitably inform the idea of a just community of living persons. End quote. A politics that recognizes the embedded and embodied nature of every gendered subject. A politics that recognizes difference. A politics that asks, who are you, not what are you? This is a politics based upon, this is not a politics based upon an abstract male individual. Instead, in the order of birth, subjectivity encompasses both nature and culture. Irigaray calls this the sensible transcendental, and it is this sort of stretching of subjectivity between or among intention of nature and culture that is at the heart of sexual difference. So this rewriting of the myth, I argue, of Demeter is an exemplary illustration of a sexuate right, this right to the free choice of maternity. This myth is rewritten in the context of Cavarero's philosophy and birth, And through this, we begin to imagine seemingly impossible worlds in which all women have sovereignty over their reproductive rights, in which sexuate subjects emerge in the polis without being abstracted from nature, from their gendered and embodied being. We are asked to imagine a philosophy, a culture, a politics that destroys any notion of women's bodies being controlled and limited, and especially used as common goods for reproductive or sexual labor. Through a focus on the characters of Greek myths and her project of the rewriting of the origins of Western thought, Cavallero imagines new worlds and new politics inhabited by new sexuate subjects. So moving from speculum through Cavallero's rewriting, we arrive at the possibility of imagining new worlds, a new polis, a figure of the maternal as the threshold to life, as prior to and engaged in a new city of the sun, where sexuate difference is infused into the polis and woman as subject can enter politics and philosophy in the feminine. Reading Cavallero's philosophy of the birth, I argue, offers a vision of a new sexuate politics. Imagine the founding of a new democracy that recognizes the role of birth and the secret relationship we all have with the maternal body that birth does, and thus nature, and thus sexual difference. Imagine entering the polis as a political subject without denying or silencing this nature. Instead of abstracted subjects, we would enter as living sexuate beings, always in relation with each other and the natural world. We would be intimately embedded and embodied. The power of birth and the maternal would permeate politics. And that is the end.
Thank you, Laura. That's given us a lot of psychic food to enjoy and mull over, but that was amazing. Thank you.